Hi there, my name is Margia. A few years ago, I made a YouTube video in which I responded to the Peer Ederer claims about methane in the atmosphere and its effects on climate change. Unfortunately, one argument I used there is, as I realize now, wrong. I feel kind of obliged to post a video correcting myself and explaining how that argument is wrong. First, special thanks to a Quora user called Malcolm Forster for pointing out the flaw in that argument to me. According to his Quora profile, he has a master's degree in chemical engineering. So let's get to the point. To give you some context, vegans are often claiming that most of our methane emissions come from cows, and that grass-fed cows emit much more methane than grain-fed cows, often citing the figure that it's around 3 times per liter of milk. Those claims are controversial, and if you dispute those claims, many vegans will respond by showing a diagram such as this one. This diagram shows the concentration of methane in the atmosphere over time. Vegans will say that our methane emissions are slightly larger than the first derivative of that curve, and that it is obvious from that diagram that our methane emissions reached their peak in the 1980s and that they have drastically fallen since. According to them, that's a lot easier to explain if we assume most of our methane comes from cows. Since grass-fed cows emit a lot more methane than grain-fed cows, and the number of grass-fed cows has decreased significantly since the 1980s. Methane in the atmosphere being somehow related to the methane we are using for energy is implausible, since we are using way more methane now than in the 1980s. Now, that argument seems to make perfect sense and is, in my experience, enough to make many people on internet forums shut up. However, it is not true. As crazy as this may sound, that diagram is almost exactly what we would expect to see if our methane emissions are constant. And I think this sounds crazy because people don't intuitively understand the difference between IT1 type systems and systems with exponential decay. Methane in atmosphere is a system with exponential decay. Its half-life is around 12 years. And I think the best way to understand it is to do the mathematical mumbo-jumbo we are about to do. Just to warn you, I am going to assume substantial background knowledge of cybernetics in this video. To understand why methane in the atmosphere is not an IT1 type system, try to derive its transfer function. Now, to somebody who only has experience in deriving transfer functions we gain in our control engineering classes, it may not be obvious how to derive the transfer function. After all, in our control engineering classes, we usually first set up the differential equations and only then derive the transfer function. And it's not at all obvious what the differential equations might be here. However, here is a clue. What is the impulse response? And it should be fairly obvious what the impulse response is. You can see the formula on the presentation. And for linear time invariant systems, such as the methane in the atmosphere, the transfer function is equal to the Laplace transform of the impulse response. So here is the transfer function. You can see it on the presentation. And like I've said, that transfer function cannot be reduced to a transfer function of an IT1 type system. Here is a transfer function of an IT1 type system. So how would the system described by the transfer function we calculated respond to constant methane emissions? Well, let's run a computer simulation. Here is the code for it in the Octave programming language. So first, what do we expect? Well, I expected it to output something like this, approximately linear growth and certainly no convergence. However, Octave outputted this. Notice that this curve is fairly similar to the curve of the empirically measured methane concentrations in the atmosphere. After seeing this curve, I asked myself, does the curve converge? Or is it like the logarithmic curve, growing more and more slowly over time, but not converging to any final value? Well, I remembered from my control engineering classes that such things can be determined using the final value theorem of the Laplace transform. The Laplace transform of the step response is of course equal to 1 over s times the transfer function. That's because the Laplace transform of the Heaviside unit step function is equal to 1 over s. So, if you apply the final value theorem of the Laplace transform and do the limits math taught in Calculus 1, you will get the result of 12 over the natural logarithm of 2. So, what are our methane emissions then? Well, if you take the data from the diagram, you can calculate that they are around 8.1 units per year. So rather than being a function reaching its peak somewhere in the 1980s and falling ever since, it is a constant. So what can be learned from this? I would have said to you to try to follow the science and data, but that doesn't help us here. In my mind, I was the one who was following the science and data. I think that we can safely say that if somebody is proposing analyzing the first derivative of the output of a system that potentially has exponential decay in it, be skeptical. Though that seems to be routinely done in social sciences. Various attempts to measure the inflation, for example. I don't know what to think about them. Second, if many people are claiming something that seems to be going against the data, like that our methane emissions are rising, there is a very good chance that you are misinterpreting the data. Third, I think that our time is not well spent attempting to tackle complicated global problems such as climate change. Why not focus on simpler problems such as superbacteria? To somebody who does basic research, it's obvious both what you as an individual should do about superbacteria and what the government should do about superbacteria. Since around 70% of antibiotics go to the egg industry, it seems obvious that what the government should do is to regulate the use of antibiotics in the egg industry, and that what you should do is to either stop eating eggs or to buy eggs from pasture-raised chickens. You get hated in the vegan world for saying that eggs are probably a bigger problem than meat is, but it seems to me more and more that it's true. Abstaining from meat is supposed to help against climate change, but it's very questionable whether it actually does that. Stopping eating eggs is supposed to help against superbacteria, and it seems rather obvious that it actually does that. That was all for this video. Thank you for watching.